Silence. A tense, unnatural blanket of stillness stretches over the mission station at Rorke's Drift, on the frontier of the Natal colony. A British engineering officer, Lieutenant John Chard, presses his ear to the hard-packed, arid earth, searching for a sign, anything to confirm his worst fears. At first, nothing disturbs the dusty calm of the African afternoon, but then he feels it. Not a sound, but a vibration, a deep tremor born in the bowels of the world, ascending through his very bones. He leaps to his feet, his face a mask of pale certainty, his gaze sweeping over his men. They are a motley collection of soldiers and invalids, frantically piling sacks of grain and biscuit boxes, building a makeshift wall against a nightmare they cannot yet see, but can already feel in the air. The humming grows, a low, rhythmic resonance that swells into a deafening, menacing roar. It is an organic, primordial sound, like a swarm of locusts the size of a mountain or the beat of a colossal heart. It resembles the rumble of an approaching freight train at full speed, ready to obliterate the small, vulnerable mission station. But there is no steel or steam in that sound. It is the thunder of 4,000 pairs of bare feet, striking the earth in unison, the war pulse of an undefeated army. It is the ominous percussion of thousands of short spears, the fearsome Ikalwa, beating rhythmically against great ox-hide shields. It is not a train. It is the Impi, the invincible Zulu army. And it is coming to wipe Rorke's Drift from the map. The epic defense of Rorke's Drift was not the product of divine intervention or a miracle on the battlefield. It was the crushing victory of desperate engineering and fire discipline over the most overwhelming brute force. This is the story of how a handful of soldiers, many of them sick and deemed unfit for combat, were led not by a legendary warrior, but by a pragmatic engineer. This man transformed a simple mission post, a tactically indefensible position, into a deadly fortress in a matter of hours. They won because they managed to channel the uncontainable fury of an ocean of warriors into perfectly designed choke points, turning the Zulus' greatest strength, their staggering numbers, into the fatal weakness that would lead them to a massacre under the African sun. At the head of this garrison of fate were two men who were not heroes of legend, but competent officers plunged into a state of professional shock. Lieutenant John Chard of the Royal Engineers was a pragmatic man whose mind saw the world in angles, structures, and vulnerabilities. At his side, Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead, a career infantry officer of the 24th Regiment, a man of military lineage and somewhat hard of hearing. They were not demigods forged for myth, but professionals who had just received the most devastating news of their careers. The main British army, their very backbone, had been completely annihilated hours before at the nearby Battle of Isandlwana. The horror of that defeat gave them no time for grief. It left them only with the ice-cold certainty that they were next. The force at their disposal was a mockery to any military strategist. Some 150 men in total, a number that included more than 30 patients confined to the small mission hospital, weakened by fever and disease. The fighting corps was B Company of the 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot, the Warwickshire. They were not an elite force chosen for a suicide mission, but the remnants of a garrison, the sick and the logistics handlers. Their motivation was not glory or the honor of the Empire. It had been reduced to the purest, most primordial form of courage: survival. Retreat was impossible. The terrain at their backs was a labyrinth of rivers and hills. The only path to tomorrow led directly through the approaching hell. Commanding the Zulu tide was Prince Dabulamanzi Kampande, a commander of proven tactical skill and formidable aggression. However, his greatest strength was also his weakness. Euphoric, almost drunk on the scale of the victory at Isandlwana, where his warriors had slaughtered over 2,300 British soldiers, Dabulamanzi acted on impulse and arrogance. Disobeying a direct order from his king not to invade the colony of Natal, he decided on his own to continue the hunt and annihilate the remnants of British power. His mind, clouded by an unprecedented triumph, saw the men at Rorke's Drift not as a challenge, but as the bloody epilogue to a glorious day, a cleanup task before nightfall. The instrument of his will was one of the most formidable armies in the world. Between 3,000 and 4,000 veteran warriors from the Uthulwana, Udloko, Indlandlo, and Indluyengwe regiments. They were an extremely mobile, disciplined, and lethal force in close-quarters combat. masters of the Ikelwa short spear, designed for disembowelment, and the large leather shield they used as both a defensive and offensive weapon. But their success in open country had created a fatal blind spot, a complete underestimation of the power of concentrated fire against a fortified position. Dabulamanzi believed that a massive frontal assault, the same tactic that had crushed the British at Isandlwana, could overcome any obstacle. He was ignorant that assaulting a fortress, however improvised, was a completely different game with rules written in blood and lead. The battlefield was a microcosm of the empire itself, an outpost, isolated, and vulnerable in a vast and hostile territory. The mission at Rorke's Drift on the border of the Zulu kingdom was not a military fortress, but an advanced post with just 2 stone buildings as its anchors, a storehouse and a hospital. Between them stretched an open space, a flat and exposed ground that, in any other circumstance, would be a peaceful meadow. But with the Zulu army on the horizon, that space had become a death trap, a void that invited annihilation. The geography of the place offered no natural defenses. It was a stage set for a massacre, where the attackers' numerical superiority seemed an insurmountable factor. The terrain was not an ally. It was one more enemy to be subdued. It was on this chessboard of despair that the mind of the engineer prevailed over that of the soldier. While others saw 2 buildings and a yard, Lieutenant John Chard saw a fortress waiting to be released from stone and earth. His genius lay not in an act of impulsive bravery, but in an engineering decision made under unimaginable pressure. He ordered the immediate construction of a defensive perimeter connecting both buildings, using any available material. Desperate men, driven by the adrenaline of terror, raised walls with heavy sacks of maize and biscuit boxes. This decision, executed in less than an hour, transformed an indefensible position into a formidable bulwark. It not only created a physical barrier, it channeled the battlefield, turning the open space into a funnel designed to force the colossal Zulu army to concentrate on narrow killing zones where every Martini Henry rifle could unleash its maximum devastating potential. The first wave appeared as a black crack on the crest of the Oscarberg Hill. The crack widened, spilled over, and became a flood of dark skin, feathers, and animal hides, a human tide of 4,000 men descending, chanting their guttural war song. For the defenders, it was a vision of the apocalypse. Prince Dabulamanzi, trusting in terror and momentum, launched his regiments directly against the north wall, the improvised barrier of grain sacks. The impact was thunderous, a collision of flesh and lead. The Zulu warriors, brave to the point of madness, charged the barricades, attempting to climb over the bodies of their own fallen comrades, stabbing frantically through any gap in the defense. The fire discipline of the British was being tested to the absolute limit of human endurance. Then the order came, shouted above the din, "Fire!" The sound of 150 Martini Henry rifles firing in unison was not a series of shots, but a single massive tear in the fabric of the air. The coordinated volleys created an invisible wall of lead that crashed into the Zulu ranks. Each rifle, a .450 caliber breech loader, could be fired by a trained soldier up to 12 times a minute, and its heavy projectile stopped a man in his tracks. The first line of the Zulu charge disintegrated, stumbled, and fell, instantly replaced by the next. It was a brutal contrast, the organic, roaring fury of the impi clashing with the mechanical, disciplined precision of a Victorian killing machine. The rifle barrels grew red-hot, the soldiers' hands blackened with powder, and the air filled with the acrid smell of cordite and blood. The first wave broke. It did not retreat in order. It vanished, leaving behind a carpet of dead and dying piled against the maize sacks. The assault, which had lasted nearly an hour, had been repelled, but the cost in ammunition and in the defenders' morale was immense. This first brutal engagement proved 2 inescapable truths. First, that the defense designed by Chard could work, that engineering and gunpowder could indeed hold back the tide. But the second truth was far grimmer. The ferocity and disregard for death of the Zulu warriors were superhuman. They would not surrender. The night was just beginning to fall, and it promised to be an eternity of blood and fire, a test of endurance that would push every man to the brink of madness and beyond. Prince Dabulamanzi, despite his aggression, made a fundamental tactical error. His warriors had captured hundreds of Martini Henry rifles at Isandlwana, an arsenal that, in skilled hands, could have suppressed the defenders from a distance, allowing his spearmen to close in with fewer casualties. However, the Zulus lacked the culture and training for marksmanship. Their concept of war was visceral, personal, and close-ranged. The captured rifles were used sporadically and ineffectively from the heights of the hill, with shots often flying high over the heads of the British. The suppressive fire that could have changed the course of the battle never materialized, leaving the defenders free to focus solely on the threat before them. Driven by the arrogance of his previous victory and frustrated by the unexpected resistance, Dabulamanzi fell into the trap of repetition. He ordered frontal assaults time, and again against the same points of the defense, primarily the north wall and the hospital. Instead of adapting his strategy and using his overwhelming numerical superiority to completely surround the position, to attack from all angles simultaneously and divide the defenders' fire until it was ineffective, he insisted on beating his head against the same wall. He failed to understand that Rourke's drift was not an open field, but a machine designed to kill, and he was feeding his best men directly into its gears. Each new wave crashed against a wall of perfectly concentrated fire. This lack of tactical flexibility became the greatest ally of the British. The small garrison, which would have been hopelessly overwhelmed had it been forced to defend a 360-degree perimeter, was instead able to focus its entire firepower on one sector at a time. Men ran from one side of the barricade to the other, reinforcing points under the greatest pressure, operating with a desperate efficiency. The battle became a brutal cycle. A massive Zulu charge would concentrate on one point, be annihilated by concentrated fire, withdraw leaving piles of corpses, and after a pause, launch again. Dabulamanzi was allowing 150 rifles to do the work of 1,500, sacrificing his veterans in waves of useless heroism against the implacable logic of Chard's fortress. As night fell, the Zulus finally changed tactics, exploiting a weak point. Using the terrain and the growing darkness, they managed to approach the hospital from a blind spot where the rifle fire could not effectively reach them. With incredible agility, they climbed onto the roof and set the thatch ablaze. In a matter of minutes, the hospital became an infernal trap. Thick smoke filled the wards, suffocating the sick patients and the defenders. The flames devoured the structure, illuminating the night with an eerie glow and casting dancing shadows of the carnage unfolding outside. The combat was no longer at a distance. It had become intimate and savage. What followed was a desperate struggle, a fight for survival waged room by room in the midst of a hellscape. The patients, men weakened by disease, rose from their beds and fought for their lives with anything they could find. The defenders were caught between the fire advancing across the roof and the Zulu warriors trying to force their way through doors and windows. The fighting was brutal, with bayonets and rifle butts in narrow, suffocating corridors. The soldiers were forced to hack holes through the interior adobe walls to evacuate their wounded comrades, dragging them from one room to another, while others held back the Zulus in a life-or-death struggle just inches away. The loss of the hospital was a devastating blow. It forced the British to abandon a significant part of their defensive perimeter and fall back to a final line of defense, a much smaller and more desperate redoubt built around the storehouse. This new wall was improvised from biscuit boxes and grain sacks, creating a small final bastion. The battle was at its most critical point. The defenders were exhausted, dangerously low on ammunition, and their perimeter was shrinking under the relentless pressure. The glare of the burning hospital painted their sweaty, powder-stained faces as they prepared for what would surely be the final onslaught. The survival of Rourke's drift hung by an impossibly thin thread. After 12 hours of incessant assaults, with the first light of dawn, the Zulus mustered their forces for one last desperate attack. A mass of warriors, exhausted but still determined, threw themselves against the small wall of biscuit boxes. The air was once again filled with war cries and the roar of rifles. For the defenders, it was the final moment, all or nothing. Shoulder to shoulder, they fired their last rounds of ammunition, fixed bayonets, and braced for the final impact, expecting to be overwhelmed by the sheer mass of bodies. The defensive line was now so small that almost every man was on the front, fighting for every inch of ground. However, something had changed. The impetus that had driven the Zulu warriors throughout the night had finally been exhausted. The enormous casualties suffered, The frustration of repeatedly crashing against an unbreakable defense, and the absolute physical and mental exhaustion began to outweigh their legendary courage. The precise and continuous fire from the little wall of the British, though less intense due to the lack of ammunition, was still deadly effective at close range. The charge, which had begun with renewed fury, started to falter. The warriors in the front line fell, and those behind them hesitated for a fraction of a second. That hesitation was contagious. The assault wavered, stalled, and finally broke apart. Like a wave crashing against a breakwater and losing all its force, the final charge dissolved into confused groups of men. The warriors, for the first time, turned their backs and began to retreat. It was not a tactical withdrawal, but the moral collapse of an army that had given its all and achieved nothing. Slowly, silently, the thousands of surviving warriors moved away from the battlefield, disappearing back over the hill from which they had emerged. The defenders, too exhausted to cheer, simply watched in stunned silence as their 12-hour nightmare came to an end, leaving behind a dawn that revealed a landscape of indescribable death and desolation. When the sun rose fully over the battlefield, it revealed the true scale of the carnage and the price of survival. The statistics were a brutal testament to the effectiveness of the defense. On the British side, the casualties were astonishingly low. 17 men had been killed and another 15 wounded, many of them during the desperate defense of the hospital. In contrast, the field before the barricades was a graveyard. The British counted over 500 bodies of Zulu warriors scattered across the ground, piled in heaps where the charges had been fiercest. It is estimated that hundreds more died from their wounds during the slow, painful retreat. The disproportion was staggering, a Pyrrhic victory for the attackers, and a mathematical proof of how engineering and discipline had multiplied the strength of a handful of men. The defeated commander, Prince Dabulamanzi Kampande, survived the battle, but his audacious decision to attack Rorke's Drift became a stain on his legacy. Within the Zulu command hierarchy, his action was seen as impulsive insubordination and a catastrophic waste of veteran warriors' lives. He had attacked a post of no strategic value, disobeying direct orders, and had suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of a force that should have been annihilated in minutes. The euphoria of his crushing victory at Isandlwana was soured by the bitter taste of this defeat. Dabulamanzi, the hero of the morning, had become the reckless commander of the night, a lesson in how arrogance can be a more lethal enemy than any bullet. For the defenders, the silence that followed the battle was almost as deafening as the combat itself. The air was thick with the metallic stench of blood, the acrid smell of burnt powder, and the smoke from the ruined hospital. The men, covered in sweat, grime, and the blood of friends and foes, moved like ghosts, stunned by exhaustion and shock. The task before them was grim: to tend to the wounded, to put out the last fires, and to face the macabre task of clearing the battlefield. They had survived the impossible. They had entered the realm of legend, but the victory did not feel glorious. It was a heavy, blood-stained relief, the simple, brutal realization that, against all odds, they would see another day. The echo of the shots at Rorke's Drift resonated with unusual force in the corridors of power of the British Empire. The news of the victory reached London at the same time as that of the catastrophic and humiliating defeat at Isandlwana. Politically, the desperate defense of this small mission post became a propaganda tool of incalculable value. The story of 150 men holding off 4,000 was amplified, embellished, and spread throughout the empire. It served as a heroic and necessary counterweight to the narrative of the annihilation of a modern army at the hands of primitive warriors. Rorke's Drift did not just save a garrison. In many ways, it saved the pride of the empire and the very justification for the war. Thus, victory was masterfully used to bolster public support for the Anglo-Zulu War, which until then had been controversial. The narrative was transformed. It was no longer a campaign of imperial aggression, but a heroic struggle for survival against overwhelming hordes of savages. The men of Rorke's Drift were elevated to the status of archetypal heroes, the embodiment of the indomitable British soldier, disciplined, brave, and capable of achieving the impossible. The story provided the Victorian public with a much-needed dose of imperial glory, concealing the strategic incompetencies and brutal realities of the military campaign. The bloodshed in Natal served to fertilize the myth of British superiority and resilience throughout the world. This event was cemented as a foundational myth through an unprecedented act, the awarding of 11 Victoria Crosses, the Empire's highest military decoration for valor in the face of the enemy. This was the largest number ever bestowed upon a single regiment for a single action in British history. This extraordinary official recognition sealed the battle's legendary status. Rorke's Drift ceased to be a mere military engagement and became the supreme example of courage against impossible odds, a story told and retold to generations of schoolchildren and soldiers as the pinnacle of the British martial spirit. It became a fundamental pillar upon which the mythology of the Empire was built and maintained for decades. The legend of Rorke's Drift has shown a remarkable ability to endure, transcending the historical context of colonial warfare. Immortalized in paintings, books, and above all in the iconic 1964 film Zulu, the story has been stripped of its moral complexities to become a universal symbol of the underdog's stand. It represents the triumph of discipline over chaos, of engineering over brute force, and of the human spirit in the face of certain annihilation. Although the war itself was a dark episode of imperial expansion, the defense of Rorke's Drift shines in the collective memory as a beacon of pure courage, a timeless testament to what a small group of individuals can achieve when they have no choice but to fight or die. Among the 11 men who received the Victoria Cross for their valor at Rorke's Drift, one stands out not for the number of enemies he struck down, but for the lives he saved amidst the chaos. He was not an infantry officer or a battle-hardened soldier, but Surgeon James Henry Reynolds, the post's medical officer. His decoration was not won with a rifle in hand, but with a medical bag, in an act of bravery that redefined the concept of heroism on the battlefield. As bullets and spears flew, as the world crumbled into fire and screams, Reynolds devoted himself to his oath with a courage that equaled that of any man on the barricade. His act of heroism was continuous and defiant. With astonishing calm, he repeatedly left the relative safety of the barricades, exposing himself to the intense fire of the Zulus to fetch water for the wounded and distribute the scarce ammunition to the men on the firing line. During the terrifying defense of the hospital, he worked tirelessly to attend to the patients amidst the smoke and flames, demonstrating a total disregard for his own safety. His valor proved that heroism in war has many faces, and that the determination to preserve life in the midst of a slaughter is as brave, if not more so, than the act of taking it. The legend of Rorke's Drift is not only the story of an impossible defense, but also that of a healer who walked through hell to offer comfort and hope.